Howdy, 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 and welcome to Thriving in the Transition, the podcast. This is episode 7. I'm truly humbled and even slightly amazed to be able to bring you this podcast and be part of your life. It really does mean so much to me. Your feedback, encouragement, and connection really make it all worthwhile. I'm going to keep coming back whether you like it or not. I'm that guy that lives on your block, and I give out full-size candy bars on Halloween just because. Doing this and connecting with you is truly amazing and absolutely inspirational for me. I hope you feel the same. I hope you feel a tenth of what I feel. So yay me, yay you, and yay us. As we continue to grow and broaden our audience here, please give us a 5-star rating, follow us, subscribe, add positive comments, like us, or give us a thumbs up, whatever that format may be for you. You can even ask questions. I'm an open book. Well, except for that chapter from Prague, right? That's off limits. Okay, and then there was that weekend in Mexico with Steve Ryman. And, okay, there was this trip with the squad, the Bourbon Trail, Louisville, Kentucky. That's off limits too. Other than those things, I'm mostly an open book. Anyway, what I'm getting at is you should connect with us. You should engage with us. Make us part of your community. We're up now pretty much everywhere. We're up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, and of course, Anchor FM. Simply search for us wherever you listen to great podcasts. We strive to be among that list of great podcasts that you listen to. We know you rely on podcasts. We know you find them useful. We want to be part of that crowd. Why am I doing this? The reality is, I'm not sure I had a choice. There's only so many ways to put yourself out there. Only so many ways to connect with people. And I absolutely love this medium and the opportunity to be my goofy, funny, and occasionally brilliant self. Another reason that I do this is to keep moving forward. I want to continue to grow as a person and as an artist. And ultimately, I want to practice what I preach. And that really is the embodiment of Thriving in the Transition, the podcast. I don't want to stand idly by and watch things happen when I know that I can make a difference. I want to be that pebble that creates ripples in the world. Besides, I'm always up for a challenge, and doing this podcast allows me, to be vulnerable, and literally to let my light shine. I don't think it's going too far to say that I want to inspire people. If what I do helps even one person to make progress and move forward during his or her transition, whatever that may be, then it's all worth it to me. That's why I'm doing this. I absolutely believe that part of my purpose is to connect with others and bring people together. I want to highlight and exemplify the fact that we truly have more in common than we do in difference. Yeah, you hear it from me every week. Those differences are much easier to identify, but discovering and appreciating the differences, that's much more fun. That's so much more rewarding. That's so much more fulfilling. So yeah, that's partly why I'm doing this. And now, more than ever, as we deal with COVID-19, fear, misinformation, and social distancing, it's important not to be alone, not to be isolated, to have a community, to have a tribe. We're all dealing with this new reality together. And that's the key word. We're dealing with it together. You're not alone. We're all going through the same stuff. It's kind of like we took that red pill that Morpheus offered us, right? And we're waking up in the bowels of the Nebuchadnezzar. Our muscles are atrophied and our eyes are sore because we've never used them before. Yes, I threw in a Matrix reference and I'm not going to apologize for it. The other part, or the rest of the story, as to why I'm doing this, I want to shine a light on those slightly enigmatic, charismatic, and inspirational people among us. I want to share their stories about thriving in and during transitions. The theory being that if you hear about other people succeeding, anyone that struggles will get the motivation or encouragement to continue to thrive in their own right, in their own respective transitions. Today's episode, it's a doozy. I was compelled to do the episode based on current events and some breadcrumbs that were left for me in the forest of life. You guys know I have a poetic soul, right? Steve Ryman gave that away during episode 5, but I do. I'm not going to deny that whatsoever. But back to this episode. I knew I wanted to do an episode on realizing that first time that the world wasn't safe. Yeah, I know that's a pretty deep topic, but it's going to be worth it. It's worth exploring and totally relevant. I promise. Let me set the stage for where we're going. On top of that, my desire to do that episode, in case you missed all the emails from every service provider or major corporation that you do business with, have an account with, a rewards card, a membership to, or you accidentally clicked on their Facebook ad, we're in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic. And all those folks who sent you all those emails want you to know what they're doing to help the situation, as well as a bit of opportunistic marketing. That's just my opinion. Who am I to judge? But let me get back to where I'm going here. I guess this episode of Thriving in the Transition is my attempt at that, letting you know my suggestions to help during this scary, confusing, and unprecedented time in human history. And it is that. We've never been here before. No one has ever dealt with this, but we are. My goal is to have things not be so scary and to help you put your arms around this shared transition, because that's what it is. It's shared. Again, you're not alone here. We touched on this briefly last week in episode 6 with Tammy Parrish, as we talked about needing a goal or a destination. That's still true, but now we're going to dig a little deeper. So the concept of being unsafe is it's pervasive. The concept of being unsafe is pervasive in every form of media in the world right now. That led me to connect the concept of recognizing that first time you realized the world was unsafe. I connected that to change. Those were the breadcrumbs. Those were the breadcrumbs that the forest left for me. I alluded to that a little earlier. Yes, we're in the depths of a huge change, but more so, we're reacting to that change very differently. Some of us still haven't taken it seriously. Some of us have stocked up on bottled water and toilet paper for some odd reason. And I believe the majority still don't know how to react, don't know what to do, aren't exactly sure how to behave or even how to wrap their heads around this whole thing. All right, so where am I going? What's the connection here? Where did those breadcrumbs lead me? I'm going to tell you. My assertion is that by reflecting on that event or situation which led you to know the world isn't safe for the very first time, you can get a better understanding of your basic responses or tendencies in the midst of change or transition. Because there's no bigger change than realizing the world is not safe that very first time. What was that insight? How can you better understand where you are in handling the current pandemic that is COVID-19 or coronavirus? You follow? Does that make sense? I hope it does. It sounded really good in my head when I was putting this whole thing together. So I hope you really get where I'm going. To me, part of thriving in the transition is simply being able to put your arms around that change or transition. Once you have your arms around it, you can now do something about it. Meaning, you can create a goal. You can set a destination. You can draw up a daily intention to get through it. And that holds for whatever the transition is, but in particular for this one. And to those ends, I'm going to tie some great information together from John Steinbeck, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and a Harvard Business Review article, and of course, my own musings. It would not be my podcast if I didn't throw in my own 2 cents. So hold on. This may be my most ambitious episode yet. That means it's going to really get good, folks. It's going to be a hell of a ride, but yet totally worth it. And we're going to jump right into it all right after this short break. So before break, I made this big claim that I was going to tie together a bunch of stuff to help you make sense of our current world transition and change to your normal lives. If you missed it, or fast forwarded past it, I'm going to tie together some content from John Steinbeck, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and a Harvard Review article that's been making the rounds on Facebook, and of course, my own musings. Before I do that, I want to go back to episode 1 of this podcast, where it all began. That episode was all about change versus transition. Why am I doing that? Well, most of us use the terms change and transition interchangeably, and that absolutely worked. In fact, I've done it in this episode already. However, I believe that there's a distinct difference between change and transition. Change is the discrete event, the thing that happens that upends the world as we knew it or that we were used to. For example, a change might be getting married or buying a house or getting a new job. The related transition is the process or act of wrapping your head around that change. If the change is getting married, the transition is getting used to sharing space, learning how to shop and cook for 2 instead of 1, becoming comfortable with the in-laws and other extended family. Transitions are, in general, longer term than change. Hopefully that makes sense. Now for the reality check. What we're going through right now. The change that we're dealing with is the appearance and spread of the coronavirus, aka COVID-19. The transition, the thing that we're all trying to wrap our heads around and get used to, sheltering in place, virtual or online activities, working from home, and social distancing. Does that make sense? I really hope it does. Now, let's get back to my Herculean attempt to tie this all together, starting with John Steinbeck's book, Of Mice and Men. I'm starting here because it'll help me share my experiences with that first time when I realized the world wasn't safe. But first, a little bit about Steinbeck's book. Of Mice and Men, it's actually a novella written by Steinbeck and published back in 1937. It's the story of George and Lenny. These are 2 guys that are going around California. They're displaced ranch hands. And this is all happening during the Great Depression. And they're looking for job opportunities. They just wanted to work. They wanted to make a little bit of money. Ultimately, their goal was to have a rabbit farm, which you have to read the book. I'm not going to dive deep into it. I'm not going to make this a cliff notes. But that's the background. These 2 guys traveling across California during the Great Depression, trying to survive, trying to make a living. And with that, an incredible story develops when they land on one particular ranch and the things that happen. Again, the book is called Of Mice and Men. But that title was taken from Robert Burns's poem, To a Mouse, which reads, and this is cool, I didn't know this before researching this topic. Robert Burns's To a Mouse reads, "The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft agly." What's that? Translation: the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. If you haven't read the book, read it. Put it on your list. I think it's American classic. Everyone should read it. It's absolutely amazing. And I've always been taken with the title and the meaning behind it. Another way that you can think about this: man makes plans and God laughs. That's according to Michael Chabon. That's nearly the same as an old Yiddish proverb. Man plans, God laughs. However, that mice thing that I'm talking about, it's going to be incredibly relevant in just a few moments here. In fact, if you didn't notice, I named this episode Of Mice and Men, in parentheses, and the coronavirus. So it's really going to tie together nicely, I hope. Steinbeck himself explained why this is such a great book to try and understand men and in my case, why it's such a great book to explain that experience of learning that the world is unsafe for the very first time. This quote, it's a journal entry. It's taken from his 1938 journal, and it reads, "In every bit of honest writing in the world, there is a base theme, trying to understand men. If you understand each other, you will be kind to each other. Knowing a man will never lead to hate and nearly always leads to love. There are shorter means, many of them. There is writing promoting social change, writing punishing injustice, writing in celebration of heroism, but always the base theme, try to understand each other." Mind blown. That absolutely fits where we are, where I want to go, and this is the dirt right here. This is the good stuff. This is where it also gets real. I'd love for you to share your answer to the question, what was the situation that made you realize the world was no longer safe? And what was your reaction to it? Put that wherever you listen to this podcast, and send me an email, put it on my LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, any of those social media platforms. Answer that question. And I'm going to answer the question for you right now. Here's my experience. When I was 4 or 5, I can't really recall, but it was somewhere in that time frame, I was living with my grandparents. In fact, I grew up with my grandparents. I continued to live with them until I left for college. We were in our first house, or at least the first house that I remember, in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, on South Sprigg Street, a very poor part of town. Some folks call it Smeltersville, others call it Smothersville. I found that it depends on your ethnicity, which is kind of crazy, but black folks tend to call it Smothersville, white folks tend to call it Smeltersville. Just a thing, it's there. This house that we lived in, it was a shotgun shack. It was nestled on the banks of a little creek that ultimately flowed into the Mississippi River. There was a front room, there were 2 bedrooms, there's a bathroom, a kitchen, and an unfinished basement. And in the unfinished basement, there was the coal-burning furnace that heated up the house. There was also a small back stoop, or transition, that led from the kitchen to the basement, or you could go outside. It's in this transitional space that I was awakened to the fact that the world was not safe. Don't get too far ahead of me right now. It's not that kind of a story, but hang in there. It's good. We didn't have many things in that place, and the things that we did have, they weren't super nice. It's safe to say that we were living well below the poverty line. But in all that place, it was home, and we were a happy family. There was me, my cousin, a couple aunts and uncles, and my grandparents. The one predictable thing about that location, Smothersville, was that it would flood nearly every year, or at least what seemed like every year to a 4 or 5-year-old. And when the Mississippi flooded, when it left its banks, we'd have to leave, and we could return when the waters receded. During our absence, nature would do what it does best, reclaim the land. It was never a total loss, but some of the not so nice things that we had were always destroyed. And so you'd have to come in and clean up and throw things away and clean out and kind of start over again. In this case, I think it was an old footstool or a chair or something. It'd become inhabited by mice. Of course, when things flood, animals need someplace safe to live and procreate. So they decided to do so inside the lining of whatever this piece of furniture was. As we cleaned up, I became incredibly concerned about the mice, and I'm not sure why. What was going to happen to the mice? I couldn't let them die. For whatever reason, I couldn't. I knew what death was, but I didn't want that to happen to these little pink, helpless mice. They were probably the cutest things I'd seen up to that point. My grandparents, against their better judgment, allowed me to keep the mice. They gave me a shoebox, and I filled it with grass or straw or hay or something to kind of keep them warm. And I kept the shoebox in that transitional space that connected the basement to the rest of the house and ultimately the back stoop that led outside. Now, some of you probably know how this is going to end, right? It's not a huge surprise. There was no way for a 4 or 5-year-old to keep these baby mice alive. Welcome back. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was a Swiss-American psychiatrist, a pioneer in near-death studies, and an author of the internationally best-selling book On Death and Dying. And while you may not know the book, a lot of you do, a lot of you are brilliant, brilliant people, you know her, I guarantee you know her. This was the book where she first discussed her theory of 5 stages of grief, also known as the Kubler-Ross model. You probably know those 5 stages. You've probably talked about them either casually or because you were going through a grief-stricken period in your life. Whatever the case, you know the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, my intent isn't to spend a lot of time here. I don't want to re-educate you on Kubler-Ross's theories or the book or anything like that. But I do want to point out that this model that was designed to discuss the 5 stages of grief, it's been adapted the world over to discuss and describe change. There it is. You see the connection. It's starting to form. I'm going to paint the picture for you. That very thing that we tend to struggle with, that thing that's usually the trigger for our awakening that the world isn't safe, has been adapted to Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model. The change curve, as it's called, it's the exact same shape as the grief curve. Yeah, sometimes it's got a few more words. We added shock. We switched anger with frustration. Depression shows up. Experiment, decision, and integration. Right? I suspect these adaptations were made to make things more palatable to the business world. The point that I want to make is with change, any change, there's a grieving period. You have to grieve during change. You're letting go of something, whether it's a person, whether it's a job or a relationship, freedom to move around your own town, or mice that you've discovered in an old piece of furniture. You're grieving something. Something is gone. And that is okay. You have to let go before you can move on. That's the whole point of Kubler-Ross's model. You have to let go before you move on. But if you never give yourself time to grieve, if you never acknowledge the thing, the situation that you're giving up, that you're losing, you never actually have the opportunity to move on. That was the trail of breadcrumbs that I found in the Forest of Life. That was the big aha around this. That's why I was compelled to do this episode. Now I want to tie things together and seal things up a little bit. We covered Steinbeck. We covered Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I also mentioned this Harvard Business Review article. What does that possibly have to do with this? It's got everything to do, and it flows really, really nicely. I'm getting super proud of myself right now for putting this whole thing together. Now, that article I first took note of on Facebook, of all places. 3 or 4 people had posted the article and what they'd gotten from it. The article is called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." It was written by Scott Barinato, and the article is basically an interview with the HBR editorial team and David Kessler. So who's David Kessler? Why is this HBR editorial team talking to him? David Kessler, he's an author, he's a public speaker with an emphasis in death and grieving. You could say he's an expert in that area. He's published a lot of books, including, you're going to love this connection, including 2 co-written with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Those books are Life and Lessons. 2 experts on death and dying teach us about the mysteries of life and living. And the other book, On Grief and Grieving, Finding the Meaning of Grief Through the 5 Stages of Grief. Yeah, his books, the titles need to be condensed, but you know exactly what they're talking about, so mad respect for that. In this article, in this HBR article, Mr. Kessler suggests that a starting point to handling grief is to understand the 5 stages from Kubler-Ross. We just did that, right? Little discussion, didn't spend a ton of time there because secretly I knew that this part of the podcast was coming. But I think we were on the right track regardless. And I'm going to use his examples of how this model fits our current coronavirus-ridden situation. So the 5 stages of grief or change, because remember, they're the same curve as related to the coronavirus. There is denial, right? This virus won't impact us. It won't affect us. Then there is anger. You're making me stay at home? You're taking away my activities? My kids have to be here all day? What? They ran out of toilet paper at Costco? I'm so angry. Then there's bargaining. All right, if you social distance for 2 weeks, if you stay at home for 2 weeks, everything's going to be better, right? That's going to fix everything. Not so much, but that's the bargaining, right? Depression or sadness. When will this thing end? I don't know when it's going to end. I don't know how much more I can take of this. That's where I think a lot of us are. But we're in different stages. It happens at different times. Lastly, there's acceptance. Hey, this thing is happening. I have to figure out how to proceed from here. That's where I want to get you. Not that I want to force you through the 5 stages, not that I want to force you through the change curve, but ultimately I want to help you get your arms around this thing. This article went on to say that the stages aren't linear. So it's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing. These things can happen at any point, at any time, in any order. And that's important to remember, especially with this little bit of knowledge that I'm sharing right now. A little bit of knowledge can be extremely dangerous. So don't expect things to happen on a timeline. Grieving doesn't happen on a timeline. That's also why most change initiatives in corporate America fail. Nearly 70%. Because you spend so much time planning the change with PowerPoints and project timelines and goals and vendors and all this stuff, when the people don't have the opportunity to grieve the system that they left behind. They don't have the opportunity to mourn what they're giving up. They don't have the time to build that muscle to look forward to what they're gaining. So it's not a time thing. It's a recognition of the stages thing. Whether you're talking grief, whether you're talking change, give yourself that time to let go. Then you can look forward to the other things that make things easier. Hopefully. So things aren't linear. They don't happen on a timeline. But the biggest takeaway, the thing that I really like, the main reason that I wanted to include this article in the podcast is that Kessler added a 6th stage of grief. Let me repeat that. He added a 6th stage of grief. He worked with Kubler-Ross's family. They'd worked together for decades. He added this other stage, the last stage, meaning. I liked that. I liked it so very much. As I look back on my experience with those mice, what ultimately got me through it was that I was able to assign meaning to the event, to that change, to the transition that meaning allowed me to wrap my head around that change. Again, as a refresher, found some mice, thought I'd take care of them. 4 or 5-year-old me, unable to do that. Mice died, I blamed myself. Where do you go from that as a 4 or 5-year-old? The love, support of my family allowed me to assign meaning. I was able to wrap my head around that transition. I was able to move on in spite of the fact that I killed these mice. And yes, I'm still using the words that I killed the mice. I know I didn't. That would have happened whether I was there or not, but that's how things work for us humans. That's why this 6th stage, number 6, in these stages of grief was so important to me. There's power in meaning. You can use meaning to your advantage to move forward and beyond all of the COVID-19 hype, fear, and misinformation. With meaning, you can take what you learn and apply it to other areas, perhaps unrelated areas of your life or other situations. Now, I got really excited about that part too, because the engineer in me just totally kicked in, because that's the essence of problem solving. Using information or knowledge from some other situation, some other data set to a brand new current situation. And that's where we are now. Coronavirus, COVID-19 is new for all of us. There's no data. Even the scientists are gathering data now. Each new case provides data that's going to go and help towards a vaccine or a cure or better prevention later down the line. They're gathering data now. But you've already got a situation that you can take meaning from and apply to where we are right now as the world. That's super amazing. That potential is there, and you've already got the experience. Ultimately, from where I sit, the meaning that you can create, with meaning, you can create your plan, your destination, your goal, your daily intention. You can do something. You're no longer powerless. You're no longer a victim. You're no longer stuck in your house. It's no longer an issue of they won't let me leave. It's no longer an issue of if they didn't eat wild game in China. It's no longer any of that stuff. You can take what you learned from your prior situations, perhaps, and again, my assertion, that first time that you learned the world wasn't safe, you can take meaning from that and apply it to the situation. Give you a little bit more understanding. As Forrest Gump would say, that's all that I have to say about that. I hope it had meaning for you. If this wasn't a new microphone, and for those of you that are looking at the Facebook video or the YouTube video or wherever you're looking at the video, I'd absolutely drop it. That's my boom moment, right? While it may not have been a definitive how-to guide, and that wasn't the attempt. This was not meant to be a how-to guide for surviving a global pandemic. That wasn't where I was going. My intent was to equip you with some tools, with a methodology, with a strategy to put your arms around this massive transition we're all in. What do you think? Did I do that? Does this help? Or did I confuse the heck out of you? Let me know in the comments wherever you listen to this, or my Facebook page or Instagram page, or wherever you can reach me. Send me an email, go to the website, whatever the case. Let me know, whatever social media platform that you want to reach out. So what's the takeaway? I've said a lot, and hopefully you took a lot, but what's the takeaway? I want to recap here. Here are the things that you should focus on with your new insights about how to handle change and transition based on what you learned from looking at that situation when you learned the world wasn't safe. And these things were supported by John Steinbeck, specifically his book of Mice and Men, an HBR article, in which the Harvard Business Review editorial team talked to David Kessler about grief. And of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5-stage model of grief. But more importantly, how that model was converted or modified to talk about change. So here are the primary takeaways. And in this case, there's 5. I'm not going to give it a top 5 category because they're not numerical, but they might be, no, they're not listed in priority order either. So just 5 things, 5 takeaways from this whole thing that you should be aware of, that you should use to get through where we are right now as a society, this point in human history that hasn't existed before. Coronavirus, COVID-19, whatever you want to call it, the situation that's got us in the house, social distancing, kids are home, homeschooling, working remotely, all of that stuff. Here are things that you should focus on. 1, focus on what you have to gain versus what you're giving up or losing. That's part of grief. And you need to focus on what you're losing, but you need to switch that to what you have to gain. What are the opportunities? What can you do now that you weren't able to do before? Can you build closer relationships? Can you build better relationships? Can you do projects with your kids now? Can you cook more? Just look at social media. There are people all over my feed that are cooking that haven't cooked before, that are experimenting with food, that are designing projects for the kids, that are reading books that haven't had the opportunity to read books. What's that opportunity for you? What can you focus on? What can you gain versus what you lost or what you gave up? So that number 1 thing, focus on what you have to gain versus what you're losing. Number 2, and you've heard this the last 2 episodes and maybe every episode of this podcast that existed, you have to have a support network. You have to have a community. It's those folks that are going to carry you through the really hard times. It's those folks whose backs you're going to need to ride when you can't lift yourself up. And you create your own community. Reference Steve Ryman, a master at building community. Who's in your community? Who can you call? Who can you email? Who can you text? Who can you FaceTime? Who can you get on a Zoom meeting? Let's go old school. Who can you write a letter to? When's the last time you wrote a letter or a card? Build, create, feed, sustain that community. You will need them to get through this thing. In my case, referencing back to the mice, if it wasn't for my family, I'd probably be in therapy, like shell-shocked by mice with like a house full of pet mice. That community, my community, allowed me to frame things in a healthy, helpful manner. They allowed me to garner meaning that allowed me to move forward and add some incredible tools to my toolkit and personality, if I do say so myself, and of course I do. So number 2, create that support network and community. Number 3, it's okay to grieve. Grief is a natural part of every change. It is. Whether you call it grief or some other term that fits more inside of the business world, doesn't matter, completely irrelevant. It's that period of letting go, whatever you call it. It's okay to grieve. You have to. Again, my assertion, you have to let go before you can move on. If you never let go, you cling to the past. Part of why those change efforts fail. I'm going to give you a little example, and I'm going off totally calling an audible now. This wasn't part of what I wanted to do. Change in action, change in motion. I'm going to create a change scenario, and I want you to do it with me. Wherever you sit, unless you're driving 65,000 miles annually, another reference to Steve Ryman. But unless you're driving or operating heavy machinery, do this with me right now. I want you to cross your arms. I want you to cross your arms like you would do if you were bored, frustrated, or upset. Pretend. I know you're not bored or frustrated. This is an amazing podcast. But pretend right now. Cross your arms. Now, cross them the other way. If you went right over left before, go left over right. If you went left over right before, go right over left. Whatever. Cross your arms the other way. How does that feel? What do you think? That's a change. A lot of you right now are thinking that, boy, that was uncomfortable. Yes, it was. Some of you were not able to cross your arms the other way. That's natural. A small percentage won't be able to. Some of you right now are doing the Macarena, right? Hey, your arms are going and you're trying to figure it out and you're doing this little rotating thing. The point, that change was just crossing your arms differently. Right now, today, wherever you listen to this, unless you listen to it 5 years from now, and I hope it's still around by then, but I'm getting all lost in my head. Today, we're living in the era of COVID-19, the coronavirus. That's a change. How can you be expected, if you couldn't cross your arms, how can you wake up one day and just deal with all the transition involved with COVID-19? You can't. That's why it's okay to grieve. That's why you have to focus on what you have to gain versus what you're losing. That's why you need that support network. And I just did a quick recap in reverse order there. So grief is a natural part of every change. It's okay. Embrace it. Number 4, the strategies of grief are not linear. They can happen in any order. Again, some brilliant people, hey, I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model for grief, and I'm at step 4. Great, if you realize that. Don't depend on it. That's not a hard and fast rule. These stages of grief or change, and I'm mixing those two together because they're the same curve, can happen in any order. Be aware of that. Just because you think you're on step 4 doesn't mean that step 2 isn't going to jump up. That's why a lot of folks, I think, are surprised when something makes them angry for no reason. Hey, I'm on step 3 and I'm past the anger phase. I've accepted it. I've gone through my anger phase and now I'm trying to accept it. I can't believe she cooked spaghetti again. Whatever it is, that anger phase popped back up. Or maybe popped up for the first time. It's all part of the same curve. Give yourself that opportunity. Things aren't linear. Give yourself some credit.